Y ahora viajaremos hacia Toronto con Sally Han. Conrado Uribe y Sally, los escuchamos.
Hi.
Hi, Sally.
Hi, how are you all? Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to have you here, Sally. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your commitment and your participation in the frame of this event. I will briefly introduce you, if that's okay for you.
Of course.
My name is Conrado Uribe, for those of you who do not know me. I'll be introducing Sally as a voiceover. Sally Han is the manager of cultural partnerships for the City of Toronto's Economic Development and Culture Division. Her portfolio includes public art, for grants programs, cultural policy, space and infrastructure development, and cultural promotion programs. Sally will be discussing 3 neighborhoods of or creative districts, as we call it in the frame of this event, in the City of Toronto. West Queen West, that's a little bit difficult for me, West Queen West, Distillery, and Art of Scarborough. Those are the 3 neighborhoods that Sally will be discussing in terms of cultural planning tools, in terms of the idea of naturally occurring cultural districts, something that has popped up in the previous presentations, infrastructure development, the conditions for success and sustainability, something very important, and of course, problems of affordability, racial justice, and equity. So Sally, thank you once again. We appreciate your participation in the context of this event, and the screen is all yours.
Great, it's my pleasure to be here. Can you see my screen? Is it shared?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. It's a great pleasure to be here. Buenos dias. And I'd like to start just by doing what we do for our meetings at the City of Toronto, although of course we are meeting virtually. I acknowledge that the land that I'm standing on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Toronto, one of the core things we are trying to do right now in such a rapidly growing city is to advance the cultural presence and visibility of Indigenous peoples who've been here for 12,000 years stewarding the land. So it's really a fundamental value as we go forward. And it's interesting because our current cultural districts aren't doing a very good job of that particular policy objective overall. So just a quick introduction about what I wanted to do, just tell you a little bit about Toronto if you don't know it that well. And I'll be talking about 3 cultural districts. I decided to swap out the Scarborough one for Bloor Street Cultural Corridor, and I'll explain why. It's a little bit because that last corridor is a bit of a different beast in the sense that this is a group of organizations who are trying to create a cultural district by and for the community through sort of marketing it together. But it's interesting compared to the other ones which were sort of more naturally occurring, why it hasn't quite happened yet. So I decided I would rather talk about Bloor Street instead, but you'll get a sense of Toronto overall as I speak about the city. So the thing you should know about the city is that it is the 4th largest city in North America, and it is it's the largest city in Canada, and it's one of the most competitive in the world. So basically, after Mexico City, New York, and Los Angeles, Toronto is the largest city in North America, although as a city region, Chicago is actually larger. So a few facts about us. The city overall as a city has about 6.5 million people, and a labor force of over, just under 5 million people. The area overall between Toronto and its regional cities around it accounts for almost 20% of the city's GDP. It's really a huge economic engine in the city of Toronto for the whole nation as a whole. It's the center of finance as well as culture. And the Economist says it's the 7th most livable city. That's partly because it has really good education, it has good parks, etc. One of the things that is really important to understand about the city, especially when it comes to things like creative districts, is that we have 100,000 new people coming to the city annually. In fact, the largest growing cohort of new immigrants to the city is the Latinx community coming from Central America and South America. And they're growing both in terms of their cultural force within the city and just in sheer numbers. Over 51% of the population is foreign born. So, and that includes myself. I'm originally born in Seoul, Korea, but I came to Toronto when I was 3 years old. And when I came to Toronto when I was 3 years old, 97% of the population was European white. So you have to understand how radical the shift has been from a majority European city in 50 years to one that is a 51% foreign born, and in about 2 years is going to be majority visible minority, or what they call global majority these days. There's a lot of languages and ethnic groups in the city, and part of that makes it enormously fun. And I do think our city motto, diversity, our strength, sort of in a global context overall, it is very celebrated and should be celebrated because we do all live very, very peaceably together. That said, it's a city that also has its own problems. One of the things that Toronto has, partly because of its very global population, is a lot of visitors. So our global tourism economy has about, it's almost 7 million, and it's been growing for the past 10 years, year over year. This slide you're seeing here is a photograph from Toronto's Pride Parade. It's the Pride Festival. Obviously, we didn't have it this year, and in the times of COVID, we can't have people all that close together. But as a major event that attracts a lot of people to the city, our culture and creative districts have partly been formed out of the experiences of the visitors that have come here, and their presence has in fact driven the tourism economy, has partly driven the development of creative districts overall. I also want to tell you that the City of Toronto is very intentional in how its relationship with culture and economy works. So the city overall does have a very strong relationship with the film sector and the live music sector and the not-for-profit arts sector. I'm responsible for a portfolio of approximately $35 million annually that go out to not-for-profit arts organizations. The film production sector as a whole contributes about $2 billion to the economy. In terms of recording music, live music, music publishing and broadcasting, Toronto is definitely the largest center of Canada. So it is a cultural industries sector overall. And another growing sector is, of course, our games, video games, and tech sector, because the tech sector is actually a very large and growing sector in the city of Toronto economically. And there's a strong overlap between the tech sector and the culture sector. Partly they all want to be co-located in the same areas. Part of the city's identity is very much associated with culture as well. So, for example, the Toronto International Film Festival, and here is a picture of J-Lo at the 2019 festival, is the fact that the recognition of the city actually jumps up in the media impressions, global media impressions, by about 80% during the Toronto International Film Festival. So the film festival and these kinds of cultural products as a whole has been enormous in helping to sort of drive out the message of Toronto to the rest of the world. I would say that's also true of what we consider our music ambassadors, like Drake and The Weeknd, who all come from Toronto. They very much have connected Toronto's culture to the rest of the world. We also produce a lot of cultural programming at the city directly. So we do a Nuit Blanche every year, which is a contemporary art a festival all night long. And that's, interestingly, these are one of the things that helped also drive some of the districts. The first Nuit Blanche was actually held in 2006. And one of the very first districts that it was ever held in was, in fact, the West Queen West district, which I'll be getting to. One of the huge challenges in the city is affordability, both in terms of housing and space, and it's due to the fact that there is so much demand for real estate. Right now in the city of Toronto, in Q1, the first quarter of 2020, prior to the pandemic, there were still more cranes in Toronto than any other city in North America. And for about the last 5 years, there were more cranes in Toronto than the next 3 cities combined. And that used to be Los Angeles, Boston, and Seattle. And Toronto still had more building going on than those 3 cities combined. So you kind of get a sense of just how insane the amount of building there is going on, and frankly, how much the economy is actually being driven by real estate. So that poses a huge number of problems in terms of increasing density and prices all at the same time. Just a quick note about the city of Toronto itself politically is that we have a weak mayor system. So we have 26 members of council only, and for a population of 3 million, that's not a lot of councillors. When I was in Scotland and in European cities, it's very common to have like 150 elected aldermen or councillors for cities. We just have 25 for the entire population, and we have a mayor that only has 1 vote out of those 25. He also doesn't we don't have any political parties. So the structure of our municipality, of our government, is very much about consensus building and sort of persuasion at all times. And that's an important thing when we're trying to drive certain agendas through. Right now, our current mayor is very, very, very supportive of arts and culture, and very supportive of the role that culture will play both during the end of the pandemic and recovery, both economic and social recovery. So we're very fortunate at this moment to really have a mayor that's Mayor John Tory, who's very, very committed to that. In our economic development and culture plan, we have 4 main pillars, and I'm just going to talk about this one. But the idea of space and access actually impacts both entrepreneurs and small businesses, as well as cultural organizations and artists. And so we have as a strategic goal for the division to improve access and sustainability of space and affordability of space. We have a number of different measures that we are using to try to do that, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do when the money seems to flow so much for the real estate. Some of our more recent policy initiatives in terms of creative spaces, and this has direct impact on our cultural district, are some tax initiatives. Specifically, I want to just give you highlight briefly the creative co-location tax subclass. That was a very unique subclass that was created specifically for creative spaces. So if there was a cluster of not-for-profit spaces, or if there was a cluster of artists working in a hub altogether, we were allowed to administer a 50% tax cut. Since the pandemic, we've sort of pushed through yet another initiative there, and we've supported the inclusion of live music venues. These are like the very grassroots live music venues of under 1,000 seats, to be available for the same tax benefit. And the music venue operators have and the landlords have worked together to try to take advantage of that. It was a very, very quick response to COVID. And we got 45 live music venues who did in fact, or 48 actually, who did in fact come into that subclass. And that actually does help the sustainability of arts organizations and cultural presenters in these districts, because when they start moving out, the whole nature and the core of the district itself starts losing its energy. As well, we have policies around the night economy and the music strategy, and some of the granting policies that we all are hoping will actually sustain some of the cultural districts that the arts community was instrumental in helping to develop. And one of those communities is West Queen West. And I want to talk about West Queen West because it's probably the best known of the global cultural communities overall. It's a art and design district, and it began sort of becoming an art and design district in the late 1990s, sort of mid in the 1980s and then early 1990s. And what happened was, and this is this is why it's called West Queen West, is that the artists had started moving outside of the downtown core to Queen West. So Queen West was about 20 to 30 minutes outside the downtown core, and they had started opening up cafes and restaurants and galleries, the same sort of elements of cultural districts that tend to happen when there's available rent, a lot of creative and entrepreneurial people all at the same time, and just a desire to get things done and create. So Queen West had been sort of where West Queen West was about 20 years ago. There were bars, taverns, music venues. There was a whole vibe with sort of new wave punk scenes and music and journalists and all of these really vibrant fashion and design sort of areas in the Queen West area all started getting pushed out with higher rents. So, and this part of the story is important. So the artists moved from Queen West to West Queen West. And one of the things that they tried to do in West Queen West was to start putting into place relationships with counselors and relationships with developers and relationships with other city officials, so that if the same kind of forces of gentrification started coming again, that they would prepare to sort of defend their territory a little bit more. Now, West Queen West, like Queen West, but more so, had a lot of existing building stock, industrial building space that the manufacturing sector had left the city for, and a lot of it was sitting empty or it was being used illegally as lofts. So they weren't zoned for living, but they were being used as live work spaces. And because of the increasing space and the space availability crisis, there was an organization called Artscape, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But Artscape and these artists and these not-for-profit organizations and these entrepreneurs all started working together in a very activist kind of way. And they formed a group called Active 18 to start ensuring that the counselors listened to their interests when the development started happening. So on this graph here, you'll see in this particular corner of West Queen West, and this is sort of the furthest part of West Queen West, there was a hotel that was developed, two major hotels that were developed that were then sort of considered the sort of hippest and coolest hotels to hang out with, as it were. And there were, but all of these were brand new condo developments going up. And so as a part of the developments that happened literally within 10 years and transforming the area overnight, because they also ripped down a lot of housing that had been used by the artists as live workspace. In exchange for the work with developers, the arts community started getting some specific benefits in its place. So you see the theater center, which is here, it gets developed with both public and private money. And we have a place called the Toronto Media Arts Centre that gets developed as a part of a larger condo development. And so even though there is a lot of gentrification happening, some of the cultural players that stay in the area are able to stay. Now, one of the reasons that the artists were able to stay and organize, and one of the biggest factors of why cultural and sort of cultural space development is looked upon so friendly by the for-profit real estate development community is an organization called Artscape. I don't know if any of you on this call are familiar with it. It's actually a really global leader in trying to find creative space solutions for artists in major global cities where the problem of affordability and sustainability of space is a major issue. So Tim Jones is sort of the founding executive director of Artscape, and Artscape has worked for the last really 25, almost 30 years now with private developers, as well as with city councils, as well as with government, to build affordable housing and affordable studio space and affordable event space for the cultural sector in places all across the city. And how they've normally have done that work is to go into industrial sites that aren't currently being activated, and to start bringing artists in there and then working with developers to see if they can extract some of the benefits of that Section 37 planning agreement, which is the density bonusing piece, and help get infrastructure developed for the artists and then maintain it at below market rents. It's very complicated what they do, and they're sometimes in an unenviable position where the arts community doesn't understand real estate development and certainly doesn't understand all of the requirements, legal requirements, and otherwise around property management. And so the artists sometimes feel that they're still paying too much, and at the same time, the artscape itself cannot find enough revenues to sort of manage the spaces they need to for major capital fixes like HVAC systems and roofs and all of the larger building facility work that any property manager has to save for and do. So they're always in an interesting space between being loved to some degree by the real estate development community and by sort of large donors and people who understand the complexity of real estate development, and not always so so kindly by the arts community, and yet they have played an enormously important role in the sustainability of space in the city. Another thing that the city did do was in 2004 invest an enormous amount of money into a nearby park called Trinity Bellwoods Park. So as the area developed overall, the public amenity space was a part of the overall consideration. And so this park is very popular now. It's a big park in the middle of the city, sort of close to the area, and it sort of grounds the public space of the area and allows for both performances and cafes sort of happening. It's often used as sort of public art installation space when people do things temporarily. And the fact that it's there is really important because it allows for there to be a natural commingling of creative artists and spaces as well as the streets. One of the other investments that the city itself made was in something called the Theater Center. And the Theater Center is really a deeply and profoundly sort of radical art space where they do a lot of experimentation. They don't have subscribers. They don't have the same artists. They're constantly experimenting between form and technology and storytelling and who stories. They're sort of radical politically. And we supported them entirely to help convert what was being used as a public health building into a theater hub. The theater center itself as an organization had been moved around at least 6 or 7 times in 12 years, moving their equipment and their gear and everything with them because they kept on being priced out. Or at one point they had occupied an old Legion Hall, and then that got sold and that got sold. And so they kept on taking on leases and then being kicked out of their spaces. So finally, when this opportunity came up, the activists of that group, Active 18 in the community, really advocated to the councillor that one of the benefits for some of these developments in Section 37 monies should go to this organization so that they can convert the building. So the city owns the building. It used to be a public library, actually, in its earlier times, and then it was public health. It was never built as a public health unit, and public health needed better facilities. So part of the deal with the developers was that the public health unit would move to new spaces that was built for their purposes, and then the theater center would take over this old, beautiful heritage building. And it's proven very successful. One of the best things about having this kind of an anchor institution in the community is that it creates a home for real creatives, for people who are not tourists, but actually the makers, the people who are really trying to make things new and show new ideas and really propose different kinds of cultural participation and activation, and plus the organization at its core is enormously generous, and that's one of the core things about this organization, which is so important to everyone else, is that they have such a strong culture of sharing, and so the fact that they want to share their facilities and share their resources as much as possible really does help drive community. So this is a bit of a funny slide. So what happens in 2014 is that Vogue magazine says that West Queen West is one of the 15 coolest neighborhoods in the city. And what it speaks to some degree, is a bit of the provincialism of Toronto at the time, really, when the city is still so looking for confirmation and approbation that they're a global competitive city, because overall, the city is still relatively new in terms of this sort of second tier ranked cities. I would say internationally, Montreal is still better known than Toronto, especially for culture and dining and all those kinds of things. So the fact that this the Vogue magazine actually acknowledged it then became this huge other issue on on Toronto media, and I just included it because I thought that was actually quite funny. But overall, you can see that the underlying conditions for the natural really development of this cultural district was the existing building stock, was those manufactured buildings that were no longer being used for manufacturing, and was the cheap rent, and the artists and entrepreneurs who had already sort of been in the area. Artscape had a huge part to do with driving some of the developments there, and its proximity to public transit, which we in Toronto we know is essential in all of our cultural districts, is that transit has to drive any kind of development, and as well as public infrastructure. I give you this as a final ironic slide to this, is that West Queen West is a superbly successful district now in a sense. And this slide is a photograph of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So in the community itself, there was a very large mental health campus, which was at one point what they used to call a lunatic asylum, where they would take people with mental health issues and lock them up and away from society. And over the last 15 years, while the neighborhood was developing, there was millions and millions poured into this to open the lands up for much more public engagement, and to allow people to talk about mental health, and to have the resources for opened up for the residents who live there. And so a part of that larger redevelopment was an art program. There were a number of different art pieces commissioned, but this one was one of my favorites, and made me laugh because for most of the residents in the CAMH facilities there, this is really not paradise, but it's a good sort of take and thoughtful provocation about what a culture district and what a cool area should be considered. The other place I want to talk about is the Distillery District, which has sort of a similar history. Again, this was sort of a natural development here, although a lot of planning had went into it. The Distillery District was an area that was vacant for a very long time after it stopped being a distillery. It was initially established in the 1860s, and it was a distillery. They made lots of spirits and liquors, etc. And then when the Prohibition came, they sort of went into disputes because they weren't allowed to manufacture alcohol. And then the place revived again, but never to the same degree. And so the building stock here is all consistently mid-19th century. So all built around the same time in the 1800s, 1860s. And so it's a very unique part, not only really in Toronto, but anywhere, in the sense that this very large tract of land hadn't been impacted. And it had cobblestones all over the place. And so you can see on this district here, it had a lot of different distillery buildings that were all a part of this giant distillery site. About 20 years ago was when this area started being redeveloped, both for residential and for commercial purposes in terms of culture district. The interesting thing about this development is that essentially it was developed with one large developer, like one large landowner who had a vision for the entire site, and that's how they started developing. And the residential towers that started being built all around here, once it also became a cool district, was part of the grand plan in terms of how the site started being animated and activated overall. What's interesting to know about the site is that, again, there were some essential preconditions. One of the things about this site before the condos, and you can see the condo in the background there, I used to live in one of those just in the background over there. I used to know the site very well. But one of the things that was that the site was used for all the time was for filming. So as a sort of a 19th century site, it was possible for anyone who wanted to do filming that looked Dickensian or 19th century to film here. So it used to be the #1 filming site in a location in North America, specifically for the purposes of this very authentic looking 19th century factory sites. I think if you've ever seen the movie Chicago, the musical, that whole film was shot here. So what's interesting about that is that once the creative district starts really being heavily developed into a tourist site with cafes, bars, all of the same things that we sort of associate with creative districts, the filming stops. So because it just gets way too complicated and difficult to shut down all of those stores and restaurants and bars in order to allow the film industry to happen there. So that's actually one of the ironic losses to the culture sector. This just shows the amount of animation here that goes on. I mean, the site is used both indoors and outdoors constantly for markets, for Christmas markets. In fact, one of the real problems about the space is that because it actually is kind of limited and very defined space, over tourism has become a major problem. So prior to this year's pandemic, they were having something called Christmas market, which was very much based on the German style sort of Christmas market idea, and it attracted so many tourists that the lives of the local residents was just hugely disrupted. The traffic all around the area was hugely disrupted because people were, parking all over the place. This is a pedestrian-only a site. There are no vehicles through it, and so people were parking all over the place in order to come in for, mulled wine and all of the various other Christmassy things that you have at a Christmas market. Like a lot of other creative districts, and if any of you are familiar with the LX factory in Lisbon in Portugal, this is a very similar vibe and feel to that, but it's also, its footprint physically on the land is actually quite limited. So over tourism really becomes a problem for the residents who are actually living there. One of the things I should also point out about the development of this space that was that, in fact, again, they had a large number of different players that helped develop the space overall. So in this building off to the left here was a 50,000 square foot building that was called the Case Goods building. That Artscape is one of Artscape's first and only projects here in this distillery district. It ended up being a hub for hundreds and hundreds of individual artists, artisans, jewelry makers, designers. They took that space and carved it up to very small offices and studio spaces to allow a wide variety of cultural actors and entrepreneurs to access space. And so that concentration of entrepreneurial and artistic energy really did help to drive the overall development of the space. Now, again, many have actually again moved out because the space is too expensive now for them, and and all of the sort of high-end fashion stores and wonderful restaurants, etc., are actually beyond the price of and affordability of many of the creatives who helped create the space. So one of the things that the City of Toronto is challenged with all the time is trying to figure out a way to capture some of the value that the artists bring to those areas and then gentrify before they leave. These are some of the restaurants and cafes and bars that make the place so much fun for tourists. And as you can see here on this map, this is where some of the development has gone. So these original small little buildings down at the end here of 60 Mill Street, sorry, they were sort of 13, 14 foot story high rises that were completely sort of reasonable within the fabric of the place. But then, the greed of the developers really came in. And so suddenly all of these 50-story buildings were being proposed for the area. And of course, the local residents just had sort of an outrageous response to it, just thinking that they didn't want to see that level of density in this neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of other sort of amenities around it yet. The two towers at the back were in fact built. The district overall is very well suited to access, in the sense that it's about a 20-minute walk from here. It's walking distance to the financial core. So there's a lot of people who are able to live here and work downtown and not even have to take transit if they don't want to. I will tell you one of the things that has happened though. So a lot of these initial buildings and housing stock that was built as a part of this creative district was done as affordable housing through a unique partnership called Options for Homes, where artists and whoever, not-for-profits or people who didn't, or low income, could have part of their down payment funded by the corporation called Options for Homes, and then if you ended up selling the building, you have to give 10% of any increase in the value of that real estate back to Options for Homes. So that actually allowed a lot of artists and creatives to finally own their own place for the first time in the area. And what did happen over time, I know this because I used to live there and I left. What did happen over time is that all of the artists left, the ones who were looking for other spaces, and every time they left, the people who come in were never artists. They were also financial bankers and lawyers and doctors and professionals, because again, the gentrification thing happened and you just couldn't afford it anymore. So I would say for the distillery district, the underlying conditions were in fact the sort of unique heritage buildings, and the fact that the space and area had already been used for culture as a whole, and that there were some core underlying things like affordable housing that allowed artists and people to live and work. And I do think that that combination of live work space for arts and artists and organizations is really essential in terms of the sort of successful development and sustainability of cultural districts. Because I'm going to go to my next example, which is an interesting one because it's not quite there. So the Bloor Street Culture Corridor is a strip of the City of Toronto's main artery, the sort of the artery that cuts east-west across the city and sort of divides the city between the downtown and the not quite downtown. Bloor Street is a major arterial road that runs across the city that way, sort of parallel to the lake where the city sits on. And this district, or culture corridor as they call themselves, is kind of more of a marketing attempt right now than it is really an identifiable district. And this is the reason why, to some degree. So you can see the concentration of, in fact, cultural facilities all around here. There's a lot of cultural facilities and major institutions, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Gardner Museum, there's all kinds of Gardner museums, the Batachou museums. There's really is a concentration of facilities and of organizations, particularly not-for-profit organizations, but it's not quite, doesn't quite have a vibe or doesn't quite have an identity. And part of that is because of the existing players on the block, on the strip of the road that it is, are organizations like the Royal Ontario Museum that have already been around for 150 years, and Kerner Hall. And these organizations, the Batachou museums, all have such strong identities on their own that they're kind of established brands, and they market themselves as established single destination brands without this sort of district feel to it. They, as institutions, they don't actually need all of the other things around them to make it feel like a destination worthwhile visiting, whether or not you're actually there with everyone else. Also, the particular strip of land is a part of the University of Toronto campus, and that's a very large campus, but it's very hard to have a definition of where the district starts and stops. There's also a number of business improvement areas, which are fantastic in terms of organizing the local businesses, but also problematic in terms of this Bloor Street corridor, the way it's defined, also has 3 different business improvement areas, all with sort of competing for identity to some degree. And there is no existing supply of building stock or artists. The housing in the area is mostly used for students, not for artists, so it's not really the same sort of conditions for there to be a district here. That said, the collaborations among the organizations are very good, and there's a distinct desire amongst those players to try to create an identity there. So I think it'll be kind of interesting to see if that's possible. I think the very difference of, I think, the Queen Street West and Distillery District is that those districts were built by entrepreneurial energy, like a lot of entrepreneurial energy, and very small players all kind of working towards the same goal. Whereas in this particular situation, there are some very large institutions and some very small institutions, and I'm not really sure whether their interests are as aligned as there are in other cultural districts. I just wanted to talk briefly before I get to my end page about the challenges and opportunities in the city. So as you've seen in other presentations, gentrification ends up being a huge problem because people just can't afford the areas that they help develop overall. Over-tourism is really a problem. Local residents start complaining a lot. And the creative districts that I discussed, both the Distillery District and the West Queen West, are really largely dominated by white professionals rather than the newcomers and immigrants who were there before, as well as artists who come from other kinds of Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. They're often not represented in these districts. Sort of the cool factor does tend to be extremely white in the city of Toronto, and that tends to be a bit of a problem. We've also had issues with real not-for-profit organizations wanting to buy real estate and become property managers when they didn't have the skill to do that, and got into a lot of trouble with that. That's probably not uncommon amongst other places as well. And one of the really big challenges that the city of Toronto meets overall is that we don't have good transportation infrastructure, public transit across the whole city. So we're trying to develop cultural districts that have access to infrastructure, to successful sort of audiences and tours. None of that will happen unless we actually develop a better sort of core transit system in the city overall. That said, I think coming out of COVID, we do have opportunities to start rethinking the kinds of cities we want. We do have opportunities to prioritize transit infrastructure and prioritize sort of the affordable creative spaces and cultural participation of everyone, and being much more inclusive than we are. So I think those are all sort of positive things that we are looking forward to doing at the city if we can. And that's it. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, Sally, thank you very much. On the contrary, we really appreciate your time, your experience, and all the insight and let's say this in-depth trip to Toronto and some of its creative districts. Certainly, as you put it at some point of your presentation, we need these sort of, let's say, provocations in order to rethink what a creative and cultural district could be. And we are sure that your examples will help us opening up our perspectives in that regard. I think, as you mentioned in your last slide, there are still some issues, no matter if we are in Canada or Colombia or Spain or France, wherever. I think inclusion, representation of different communities is something that is always an issue. As I said before, no matter if it's Medellin or Toronto, I think we really need to think about that. And I think I have to say that we could have not ended, today's journey in a better way. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your involvement. We know that the agenda has taken a little longer than expected. We know it's a little bit later than we wanted to be, and we really want to respect everybody's time, of course, including yours.
A todos, gracias. Feliz día para quienes están conectados en el uso horario de Bogotá-Miami. Feliz noche para quienes están conectados desde Europa. Have a good day. Feliz día. On se voit demain. Très bonne journée à vous tous. Merci. Gracias.
Nos gustan las distancias cortas. Te estamos esperando en www.cccreativas.com.